In the previous two modules of AD and AS, we covered Keen's cross model and ISLM curves. We had assumed that prices were constant in these two modules. In this third module, we focused on changes in AD and AS as prices are allowed to be changed. The module also covered the following other parts: shifts versus movement factors, what triggers aggregate demand to change, short-run aggregate supply SRAS and long-run aggregate supply LRAS. Three factors were discussed which lead to changes in aggregate demand or aggregate supply equilibrium triggered by prices. Real balance effect: price increases, purchasing power decreases, individuals' monetary wealth decreases, the quantity demanded decreases. Interest rate effect: price decreases, real value of money increases, interest rate decreases, investment increases, aggregate demand increases. International trade effect: price decreases, real value of money increases, interest rate decreases, net exports increases, aggregate demand increases. Then, the shift versus movement factors for aggregate demand were revisited again. It was discussed that when the spending on countries' goods and services changes, aggregate demand curve shifts accordingly. Four major spending components have been identified. They are consumption, investment, government purchases, and net exports. This expenditure amount will shift up if consumption rises, investment rises, government spending rises, or net export rises. It will decline or shift down if consumption falls, investment falls, government spending falls, or net export falls. Then the factors affecting all individual components of aggregate demand were discussed. The factors that affect consumption: wealth. Wealth increases, consumption increases, aggregate demand increases. Wealth decreases, consumption decreases, aggregate demand decreases. Expectations about future prices and income: expect higher future prices, consumption increases, aggregate demand increases. Expect lower future prices, consumption decreases, aggregate demand decreases. Expect higher future income, consumption increases, aggregate demand increases. Expect lower future income, consumption decreases, aggregate demand decreases. Interest rate. Interest rate decreases, consumption increases, aggregate demand increases. Interest rate increases, consumption decreases, aggregate demand decreases. Income taxes. Income taxes decreases, consumption increases, aggregate demand increases. Income taxes increases, consumption decreases, aggregate demand decreases. The factors that affect investment: interest rate. Interest rate increases, investment decreases, aggregate demand decreases. Interest rate decreases, investment increases, aggregate demand increases. Expectations about future sales. Businesses become optimistic about future sales. Investment increases. Aggregate demand increases. Businesses become pessimistic about future sales. Investment decreases. Aggregate demand decreases. Business taxes. Business taxes. Business taxes increases. Investment decreases. Aggregate demand decreases. Business taxes decreases. Investment increases. Aggregate demand increases. The factors that affect net exports. Foreign real national income. Foreign real national income increases. Exports increases. Net exports increases. Aggregate demand increases. Foreign real national income decreases. Exports decreases. Net exports decreases. Aggregate demand decreases. Exchange rate. Interest rate falls. Currency depreciates. Exports increases. Imports decreases. Net exports increases. Aggregate demand increases. Interest rate rises. Currency appreciates. Exports decreases. And imports increases. Net exports decreases. Aggregate demand decreases. Then, the effect of changes in money supply on aggregate demand was discussed. A change in the money supply is a catalyst in a process that ends with a change in aggregate demand as follows. A change in the money supply affects interest rates. A change in interest rates changes consumption, investment, and net exports indirectly through the impact of exchange rate appreciation or depreciation, and a change in consumption, net investment, and net exports affects aggregate demand. Then, the short-run aggregate supply was discussed. A short-run aggregate supply SRAS curve shows the quantities supplied of all goods and services, real GDP or output at different price levels. The SRAS curve is upward sloping. It was also discussed why the SRAS curve is upward sloping. Sticky wages. If wages are sticky, a decrease in the price level which pushes real wages up will result in a decrease in output. This is what an upward sloping SRAS curve represents. As the price level falls, the quantity supplied of goods and services declines. Worker misperceptions. It was discussed that workers benchmark their willingness to work based on the nominal wages and not real wages. And in cases of price changes, this may result in misperceptions and therefore a lowering in supply of labor. This impacts the aggregate supply. In conclusion, if workers misperceive real wage changes, then a fall in the price level will bring about a decline in output, which is illustrative of an upward sloping SRAS curve. The above are movements within the SRAS based on price changes. Then, the factors that create shifts in SRAS curve were discussed. Wage rates. Thus, a rise in equilibrium wage rates leads to a leftward shift in the aggregate supply curve. The steps are simply reversed for a fall in equilibrium wage rates. Prices of non-labor inputs. An increase in the price of a non-labor input, example, oil, shifts the SRAS curve leftward. A decrease in the price of a non-labor input shifts the SRAS curve rightward. Productivity. Productivity describes the output produced per unit of input employed over the same period of time. An increase in productivity means businesses will produce more output with the same unit of input. This causes the SRAS curve to shift rightward, similarly vice versa. Supply shocks. Major natural or institutional changes on the supply side of the economy that affect aggregate supply are referred to as supply shocks. Two types of supply shocks were discussed. Adverse supply shocks, that is, bad weather, a major cut in the supply of oil, shift the SRAS curve leftward, and beneficial supply shocks, example, major oil discovery, shifted rightward. Then the overall short-term equilibrium was looked at. This was then summarized. Then the long-run equilibrium was discussed, wherein it was assumed that it is governed by the long-run supply equilibrium. It was discussed that in the long run, all the factors that affect the SRAS, sticky wages and worker misperceptions, get ironed out automatically, and then the economy is said to be in the long run. In other words, in the long run, these two conditions do not hold. Owing to the above, the long-run aggregate supply LRAS curve exhibits itself as a vertical line in exhibit. The level of real GDP that the economy produces in long-run equilibrium is natural real GDP, QN. Then it was argued that the long-run equilibrium is likely to be different from the short-run equilibrium. In most cases, it is likely to be higher than the short-run equilibrium.